Hello everyone, welcome to our first art lesson with the Faith and Family Homeschoolers Co-op. For our first lesson, we're going to start on lesson 16 in the art pad, which is Watercolor Implied Textures. And in this lesson, we're just going to practice different techniques for making textures with watercolor paints. And then we're going to use the techniques we learn and practice with to make a fantasy landscape in the next lesson. You can really use any set of watercolors you'd like for this lesson, but for the purposes of this video, I ended up just using a regular set of Crayola watercolors. The art pad recommends that we use liquid watercolors, but seeing as those are often much more expensive supplies, I opted for just using the regular Crayola watercolors. And the techniques I use in this lesson are going to be a little bit different from what it says in the art pad, but it's just going to reflect better usage of the Crayola paints instead of the liquid watercolors. What we need to do first before we start any painting at all is to just take our 3 sheets of watercolor paper and divide them in half to prepare them for each of our different textures. Our first 2 textures, the grass and leaves and bushes texture, are going to require a base coat of some yellow-green on the paper before we do any of the actual textures themselves. So I'm just going to lay that base coat down first, and then we're going to set these aside to dry for about 30 to 40 minutes before we go back and do any of the actual textures on them. In the meantime, we can go ahead and work ahead on some of the other textures that come after these 2. We just want to make sure we have that base coat laid down first so we have plenty of dry time. To mix up my yellow-green, I'm just going to take some water from my paint cup and add it to the yellow in my paint set. And then I'm just going to go ahead and spread that over a pretty decent sized area on the page. It doesn't have to be real precise, you just want to make sure you have a good sized background to work with. When I'm adding my green tint, I want to make sure that my brush is washed out very well before I go ahead and dip it into the green at all. We just want to avoid mixing any colors in the paint wells themselves so that there's no contamination for any future use. I'm going to do with the green exactly what I did with the yellow and just put that green right over top of the yellow. You want to make sure that your yellow paint is still pretty wet before we go ahead and mix any of the green in, because when that paint dries, it's not going to mix hardly at all and it's just going to put the green right over top of it. So I want to make sure that both my green and my yellow are still pretty watered down so that they'll mix well and create that nice yellow-green color for me. I'm going to repeat that process for the other sheet of paper, and we're just going to set both of those aside to dry. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and start working on the clouds texture. For our clouds texture, we're first going to take some plain water and spread that all over the page before we add any color at all. Make sure that your water is clean before you do this though, and it's perfectly fine to change out your water before you start. When I paint the clouds, I'm actually going to use a little bit of a reverse technique where I put out some color around where I want the clouds to be, and I'm not going to paint the actual clouds themselves. This is simply because we can't really paint white with watercolors, so I'm just going to have to settle with painting the area around it, and it actually comes out with some really cool effects. If at any point you feel like your colors aren't blending and spreading around as easily as you would like them to, you can always just go back and add some more water directly to the page. And I'm just going to keep repeating this technique all across the page, where I just take a little bit of color and I spread that around, add a little bit of more water wherever I need it, and leave some white spaces so I can actually see those cloud shapes start to develop. Once I'm satisfied with how my clouds look, I'm just going to set that aside to dry so we can go back later and add any more details that we'd like. Our next texture is the salt texture, and what I'm going to be doing for this one is just take a clean sheet of paper and put a pretty thick layer of water all over the face of the paper. Then I'm going to go back in and add any colors that I'd like. You can use any color you'd like for this portion, just make sure that it's decently dark in color. I'm going for more of an earthy tone, so I'm going to be using some green, brown, and yellow to create my desired look. But again, whatever color you choose, you just want to make sure you put enough of it down so that it's pretty dark, as this will help us see our effect a lot easier. Once I'm happy with the color that I have on the page, I'm going to go ahead and put my paintbrush away and take a couple pinches of salt and just sprinkle that all over the color. I did find out when doing this project that it's probably best to add just a little bit of salt as opposed to a lot of it. I wasn't really sure how pronounced the outcome would be, but right here would probably be a pretty good stopping point. You can see right here that I used quite a bit of salt and it just drew out more of the color than I thought it would. Also, if your paint was getting too dry in this process, you can always go ahead and add a little bit more water in different spaces like I did here. Once I'm happy with the amount of salt and water on that sheet of paper, I'm going to go ahead and set it aside to dry and get started on the spatter texture. This texture is going to get a little bit messy, so I'm just going to grab a scrap sheet of paper and put that right underneath the piece of watercolor paper. This is another texture where we're going to have to start out with a wash of just plain water all over the face of the watercolor paper. So once I have all that water down, I'm just going to add a light layer of gray for a nice base color. Now that I've got my background down, I'm going to start mixing up a secondary color to splatter over the top of it. When I was mixing my secondary color, I made sure to keep a lot of water in my brush and just keep mixing it into that red pigment, so the color started to sort of pool in the color well. Then I could pick some of that color up and start to transfer it into one of the palette wells. Transferring it into the palette well was just a little bit tricky, which is why I made sure that there was a lot of that colored water pooling into the actual red paint itself. That way when I picked it up in the brush, all I had to do was push the brush to the side of the well, and that colored water would start to drip out of the brush and pool in the bottom of the palette well. Once I had a decent amount of red in the well, I washed out my brush and did the same thing with the black pigment. And I started to drip that into the sides of the same well so that once I was finished getting out all of the black I wanted, I could just mix all of those colors together to get a darker red. Now, using that color we just made, we're going to take a toothbrush and dip it into that color and start to splatter it all over the background that we already put on. So to do that, I just grabbed the top of the toothbrush and ran my thumb across the bristles to get those fine splatter marks. And you can also do larger drips if you like, where you just take the head of the toothbrush and tap it against your finger so that those large droplets will fall onto the page. At this point, you can get as creative as you want. I went ahead and mixed a darker red color and started to splatter that in different areas as well, just to get a little bit more differences in the colors. You can add any colors you want, or you can stick with what you already had, whichever is your preference. It'll also be a good idea if, when you get closer to the corners of the sheet of paper, to adjust your watercolor paper so that it sits more in the middle of your scrap sheet, just so we're not flinging all those drops of color all over the desk. Once I'm happy with my finished product, that is all we have to do for the spatter texture, so I'm just going to set that aside to dry and get started on the star texture. To make my stars, I'm just going to take a white crayon and draw little dots wherever I want stars to be on the paper. The wax from the crayon is going to stop the watercolors from mixing into it, so once everything is all dry, wherever we put the white crayon will stick out from the rest of the watercolor paints. Now I'm just going to go back in with a darker color and I'm going to spread a thin layer of that all over the paper. I chose to mix up a little bit of navy blue where I just put some black on the page first and then added a thin layer of blue over the top of it, but you can use whichever color you would like. You'll notice as I spread my paint all over this page that wherever I drew with the white crayon, the paint is not adhering to the page. So this technique is very useful where we want to have maybe some writing or other objects that we draw stick out against the watercolor paints. Once I'm satisfied with how this looks, there's nothing else I need to do with this texture, so I'll just set it aside to dry. And then we'll pick back up with the grass and the leaves and bushes texture that we started on earlier. To make my grass, all I'm going to do is take different shades of green and paint them up in different sizes of strokes. I'm going to do some a little taller than others, some shorter, some a little bit wider, some skinnier. And I'm also going to point them in different directions just so it looks a little bit more natural. After I have this first layer of strokes done, I'm going to go back in and do layers of different colors once they're all dry, and this will just help my grass look very natural and realistic. That is all for the grass texture, and now I'm going to be moving on to the leaves and bushes texture. To get my color for the leaves and bushes, I'm going to be using the same technique I used to mix up the color for the splatter texture, where I'm going to just take a bunch of water and load it up into my green color, and then drip that color into one of the wells of my palette. You can make your leaves whichever color you choose, but I wanted to do a dark green, so I just took some water and activated my black paint and started to drip that into the same paint well as I had the green in. And then I just mixed those up and my color was all ready to go. Now with my paper towel, I'm just going to pick up a little bit of that color and dab it onto the paper to make some irregular shapes for my leaves. If you want to have a little bit more variation in your colors, if you'd like, you can just mix up a different color of paint. I'm just going to add a little bit more black to mine to make them a little bit darker, and then I'm going to do the same thing I just did with the paper towel, and I'm going to pick up little bits of that color and dab it on the paper. Now that I'm finished up with that, I'm just going to set that aside and wait for it to dry, and I will finish up putting a couple little details on my clouds texture. You can put on any little details you want to your cloud texture, but I just decided to add a couple little birds, and for that all I needed was just a little bit of black paint, and I just drew a couple real thin lines to create the outline of some birds flying in the sky. Lastly, I'm just going to finish up my salt texture. All you need to do to finish this is brush off the salt into a trash can, and then we're left with our final image. We are now all finished with each of our textures, and we'll pick up with applications of them in the next lesson. Thanks!